Hello everyone, welcome to my YouTube channel. This is my third video, ebook 2.2, focusing on purchase order or PO processing in accounts payable function. What are we going to understand through this video? We'll understand what is a purchase order, which is PO, what is the PO life cycle in procure to pay process, what are the roles and responsibilities involved in the PO process, what is the PO matching in AP, what are the common PO matching issues that you can encounter, handling PO exceptions, tools and ERP integrations, PO controls and compliance, and we'll also talk about some of the best practices. And finally, we'll also talk about some of the interview questions that you can expect from this section of the training. What is PO or a purchase order? It's a PO is a formal request from a buyer to the supplier listing the items, quantities, and agreed price for products or services. It's a legally authorization for the supplier to fulfill the order. Now let's understand what is the life cycle of the procure to pay in the PO process. It starts from purchase requisitions, PO creation and approval process, PO dispatch to the vendor, delivery and goods receipt, and then finally invoice receipt and three-way match. So if I have to explain it again, you wanted to make a purchase, there is a requisition that is created, you create a PO and it follows an approval process. The approval process depends on the value of the PO. If the PO is at the higher value, it needs the higher level of approval. And once it is approved, the PO is dispatched to the vendor or the service provider, and then service provider acknowledges the vendor PO, it delivers the goods, and then finally, for the goods that are delivered to you, you receive an invoice and it follows through a three-way match process. Now, let's understand what are the roles and responsibilities within the PO process. The PO process starts from the procurement team who initiates and approves the PO, which means they wanted to buy something and then they create a requisition. Next is the vendor. Once the PO is ready, it is sent to the vendor. The vendor acknowledges and fulfills the requirement of the PO, and then the goods are received by the warehouse or the receiving team, which confirms the goods receipt, which is also known as GRN. And then final step is for the goods and services that you received. AP team receives the invoice, which also uses the PO for matching the invoices. Now let's understand what is a three-way and a two-way matching process. Two-way process is primarily for the services. For example, you have an electricity service that you are using, you have a water service, which mostly do not go through a PO process. So the way invoice is processes, it is PO versus just the invoice. And the next is a three-way match process where the matching involves PO, the GRN, and the invoice, which means when the invoice is received, you look at the invoice, there should be a PO number mentioned on the invoice. And then the third step is you go and validate if there is a GRN note made. There is something called as a four-way match process also. It includes quality inspection in some of the services that are provided. For example, there's a building construction that is involved. In this case, there is a four-way process, which is a PO, a goods receipt note, invoice, plus also the quality inspection of the site construction. Now let's understand what are the common PO mismatching issues that you can see. One of the first and primary is quantity and price mismatch, which means the PO that you created is for $10 and then quantity asked was 10 units. But when you receive the invoice, the PO or the invoice has $12. and instead of 10 quantity, the quantity mentioned there is either 12 or 10. It can be higher and it can be lower also sometimes. The other issue that you can face is partial goods received, which means the PO was issued for 100 quantity, but you only received uh, 50 or less than 100. And then the other issue that you can face is wrong PO reference on the invoice, which means when you received an invoice, that invoice pertains to an X order or an X PO, but the PO number mentioned on the invoice is for a different services or a different product. And then sometimes you will also encounter that expired or closed PO, which means you issued a PO in your system, the PO is expired, against which you received a goods, which means you issued a PO. Later, you decided that it has to be either cancelled or there is a deadline that was available for the PO. And then in your system, the PO is closed, but you also received goods or invoices for that PO. Now, let's talk about what are the exceptions that you go through the PO process. First is manually review and communicate with the procurement or vendor. For example, there is a quantity, uh, there is a less quantity that you received for one of the PO that is issued, and then in this case, you manually review the PO. You talk to your procurement team and talk to vendor if they are going to resend the goods which are either short or receive the goods either which are sent in excess. Some of the exceptions require approval process. For example, there is an excess goods that you received. You still want to consume those goods, and then for which you will still need an approval. And then the third exception is adjustment to a credit or debit note if needed. For example, uh, vendor issued an invoice with the excess quantity and excess amount, then we can ask the vendor to provide the credit note. And once the credit note is processed, the value is offset, and you can go ahead and process the invoice. What are the tools and ERP systems which are primarily used in the PO process? The first one is SAP module, and then second one is Oracle purchasing. Third one is Coupa, Ariba, and then there are multiple other tools or ERP systems which are available. And finally, RPA for PO verification and workflow routing. Now let's look at what are the PO controls and compliance, which is very important part of the PO process. The first one is PO approval metrics, which means every PO which is available has to go through an approval metrics. For example, it's a PO for less than $10,000. It requires uh, a level approval by a senior manager. If the PO value exceeds greater than 10,000, it also needs additional approvals. Every organization has multiple layers of approval processes depending on the value of the PO. The second one is you should enforce the mandatory fields or information that is required. Now, for example, the total quantity, the currency, the price for which you are buying, and then finally compliance with budgeting and delegation of authority, which means the purchase that you are making, it should be budgeted in your budget, and delegation of authorities should be signing off on the PO before it is sent to a supplier. Some of the best practices of the PO process is avoid manual PO creation, which may involve typo errors. And then second one is enable automated matching wherever possible. And then third one is set PO tolerance for monitor price and quantity variance. And then fourth one is train vendors to correctly reference PO numbers on the invoice. Finally, let's talk about what are the uh, PO related questions that you can expect in the interview. The first thing I have listed here is, can an invoice be paid without a PO? uh, only in specific cases, utilities, legal fees, etc., with documented exception approvals, the invoice can be paid without a PO. If not, for any physical goods, there should be a PO mentioned on the invoice before the payment is initiated. The second question that you can expect is, what if PO is received after an invoice date? For example, your invoice date is 18th of July, but the PO dated is 19th of July. In this case, system creates an alert and it does not let you process. So the way you can handle is you can amend the PO with a retrospective date and then follow it through an approval process. And then third question that you can expect is, who should approve the PO? The way you can answer is, follow your organizational delegation of authority metrics, which means every organization has list of approvers depending on the rules and then depending on the PO that has been issued. So we should definitely follow the internal protocols of approval process. Conclusion on PO. Efficient PO processing ensures that payments are linked to valid purchases, improves visibility, and reduce invoice duplicates. Standardized workflow and automation improves uh, the frauds and other issues that gets involved in the PO process. Thank you for watching the video. Please subscribe for watching more videos on accounts payable and accounts receivable processes.